I'm glad to see so many here, and very welcome to this symposium on the expansion of low oxygen zones in the global ocean and coastal waters. My name is Martin Jakobsson. I am the Vice President of the Academy, and I am the Chairman of this environmental committee that has organized this event. In support, I should say, by the Baltic Sea Center at Stockholm University, Baltic 2020, and the Swedish Agency for Marine and Water Management. We never say that in English, so that's... So I will be also moderating the session that is coming. But before we start with that, I think we should have some practical points. One is that we have emergency exits over there and also in the back. And also, don't forget to turn off the cell phones, or at least put them on a silent mode. And the event is filmed, as you can see in the back there, but we have decided not to film the actual questions. So feel free to ask any questions. They are not filmed, nor are the answers of the questions, but the actual speakers are filmed. Before I actually move on and we'll have the introduction here, I'd like to sadly say that there are 3 giants in the ocean field that passed away within 2 weeks, actually, the last 2 weeks. And that's Wally Brooker, or I should actually start with the oldest, Walter Munk. He was truly a giant in our field, and he was from Scripps, and he died at the age of 101. He received the Crafoord Prize, which we consider is the Nobel Prize equivalent in geosciences here at the Academy. Then Wally Brooker passed away only a few days ago at the age of 87, and I suspect that almost everybody here know about Wally Brooker and the conveyor belt and everything that he came up with. He also got the Crafoord Prize here at the Academy. And then lastly we had Gustav Arrhenius, who passed away at the age of 96, also within these last 2 weeks. And he's also a giant in the ocean field. He got the Hans Pettersson Medal in gold here at the Academy. And he was also part of the, as we consider, the first really oceanographic paleoceanographic expedition where you took long sediment cores, etc., the Albatross expedition. So I think we should honor all these 3 giants with the silent minute. Okay, so let's think about all the fantastic things they have done and not let this put a damper on the event, because I think they truly have made some discoveries and also died at very old ages, and almost all of them were, or all 3 of them were very active into the very last end. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Daniel Conley, who's going to say some word about the background on this event and where we're going. Thank you.
Good morning. On behalf of the Environmental Committee at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to each and everybody here today, both the speakers and the participants as well. I also want to make sure we acknowledge once again the support from different funders, Baltic Sea Science Center at Stockholm University, Baltic Sea 2020, and also HAV, the Swedish Agency for Marine and Water Management. They've been very generous in helping us carry out this symposium. The Environmental Committee has done 2 previous symposiums on the oceans, and one was on ocean acidification a couple years ago, and there was one last year on how the oceans would react to a 2-degree plus warming. And we thought it was pertinent to run this particular conference on ocean hypoxia and coastal water hypoxia, because there's a report coming out soon from the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, that should have come out by now, and this was going to be a celebration of that. But it'll be a great report when it makes it the press. There are a number of reports, scientific reports, that have documented a decline in oxygen concentrations in the world oceans, both in open oceans and the coastal waters. And this decline started somewhere in the middle of the last century, the 20th century. We are well aware of oxygen problems here in Sweden, in the Baltic Sea, in our own backyard. And those problems are well known. Today, there's something on the order of 65,000 square kilometers of area that have low oxygen in the Baltic Sea. That's 1.5 times the size of Denmark. It's quite amazing. This loss of oxygen in waters and in bottom waters is actually one of the most important challenges facing us today and facing the health of the oceans. And we're increasingly modifying the oceans by humans. The temperatures have increased. We've increased CO2 levels. We've increased nutrient inputs to the coastal zone. And we've altered the abundance and distributions of a variety of different marine species. There's currently an international network of scientists called the Global Ocean Oxygen Network that's sponsored by UNESCO. And it's recently been established to take a multidisciplinary approach to look at the loss of oxygen. Some of the speakers here today are also part of that network, and some in the audience as well. So during this symposium, we're going to address various aspects of declining oxygen in the global ocean and coastal waters. And it's done through both presentations and discussions. You should note that after each presentation, there's a time set for 15 minutes for discussion. So we're hoping the audience is active in asking questions and bringing the problems forward. The talks range from everything from the oxygen minimum zones in the open ocean to processes in small estuaries. So it should be a very interesting day. And we hope that this symposium will help raise the awareness and, more importantly, the understanding of the problem of hypoxia and strengthen our ability to manage this pressing global problem. Thank you. I should note, unfortunately, Jakobsson is not able to come because of a family emergency, but Robert Almstrand instead will give his opening remarks. Robert?
Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, so unfortunately, Jakob had to cancel his participation today, but he asked me to convey his best regards and say a couple of words on behalf of him and HAV. So first of all, HAV is delighted to support the arrangement of this symposium on the expansion of low oxygen zones in the global ocean and coastal waters through our partnerships in the public sector and academia. While this symposium is exploring the impacts of low oxygen in coastal waters, I would like to focus my introduction on how we can tackle the root cause of primarily nutrient runoff to the coastal ecosystems from a management perspective. The key drivers of low oxygen zones are to a large extent known, but the impacts of anoxia on ecosystem processes and biogeochemical pathways need further research and knowledge generation. Drivers that contribute with nutrients to the ecosystem or in other ways exacerbate the symptoms of eutrophication include agricultural runoff, energy production based on fossil fuels, fisheries that impact trophic levels and nutrient balances, and internal nutrient feedback processes under anoxic conditions. These drivers are linked to the development of our societies and lifestyle choices. The expansion of low oxygen zones impact both developed economies and economies in development. It's a global phenomenon All of the drivers may be different, ranging from high levels of consumption to poverty that erode the carrying capacity of landscapes, and policy choices such as the EU Common Agriculture Policy. Most of the marine pollution, including nutrients to the ocean, comes from land-based sources. Therefore, there's a need to tackle the upstream sources of nutrients to prevent the impact of anoxia. So let me give you 3 key examples. First, development of business and market models to treat the remaining 80% of the sewage water which is still without treatment globally. Now, of course, this poses health risks and environmental risks, but point sources can be tackled, particularly if sewage is managed as a resource and not as a waste. That is, the nutrients in the sewage should be recycled and treated as any scarce resource. Now, this requires us to move towards closed-loop systems. Secondly, management of nutrient runoff from agricultural lands. We need pricing signals for fertilizers and the handling of natural manure, precision farming and no-tilling practices, green infrastructure in the agricultural landscape such as barriers, wetlands, and managed drainage, and also low-impact forestry in terms of impacts on forest hydrology. And finally, decarbonizing the energy system. We need to increase and/or switch to renewable energy alternatives such as wind, solar, wave, biomass, and hydropower. For areas that already suffer from anoxia, research and pilot programs in Sweden and globally demonstrate that in the coastal zones, nutrients and sediments can be immobilized using different technologies, such as addition of aluminum salts, although further risk analysis is much needed. Structural liming in soils can improve soil structure, resulting in both higher crop yield and reduced leakage of phosphorus to recipient waters. In the open ocean, technologies such as geoengineering, for example, pumping oxygen to deep waters, have been tested, but further proof of concept is necessary. And this includes risk analysis at the ecosystem level and the long-term phosphorus binding efficiency in sediments after such treatment has ceased. For areas that are being rehabilitated, opportunities to both sequester CO2 and contribute with oxygen can be to rehabilitate eelgrass beds, and the use of blue catch crops such as algae, mussels, and ascidians is promising but needs further research and development as well. In summary, there are many measures to deploy depending on the geographic and socioeconomic scope of the challenge. Now, the question is, how are we tackling this in Sweden? Well, we're tackling the issue of low oxygen in our coastal waters using all the different measures just mentioned. The key to resolving this challenge is to take a systems approach. We call this management from source to sea. This means that we look upon the catchment as a key entity in which many activities take place in conjunction. In parallel, we're assessing the coastal and ocean ecosystem to identify the key sources of nutrients and other pollutants in these systems. We're using different management frameworks, such as the EU Water Framework Directive, the Marine Framework Directive, and Marine Spatial Planning, and explore how they interlink also in the national legislation. Moreover, stakeholder engagement is critical. We work with different actors, such as public agencies, the private sector, and citizens to identify steps forward. Now, this includes a new investment in advancing measures at the catchment level and the establishment of a digital knowledge platform for long-term learning. We also work at the international level through our regional bodies HELCOM, OSPAR, and the EU to develop policy and legislation, and with the UN system to develop lessons learned, including financing at the global scale. Finally, we work with academia to develop new knowledge on how to reduce the flow of nutrients to the oceans, the impacts of degraded water bodies on the ecosystems, and how to restore low oxygen zones in both inland and coastal waters, including co-financed projects with the EU, such as Life Rich Waters. In conclusion, low oxygen levels in our coastal waters and oceans is a classic collective action problem, in which a common pool resource such as achieving the Sustainable Development Goal 14, a sustainable ocean, can only be addressed if we all work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So then it's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker here. which will be Denise Breitburg, I don't know if I pronounce it correctly, from senior scientist at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center in the United States with a specialty on marine ecology. And I Googled on Wikipedia, and it says that your specialty is to study dead zones. And I just wonder how that is perceived from the outside community, apart from us. So please come up. And Denise's title is "The Ocean is Losing Its Breath, an overview of the problem, its effect, and solutions."
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming, and I especially want to thank Dan Conley and the Swedish Academy and all of the other groups that sponsored this, this symposium. It's a real honor to be able to speak here, and it's very heartening that there's so much attention on this important issue. When we think of the problem of the loss of oxygen in the oceans, we first need to really think about why the oceans are so important to us. The ocean, and by ocean I'm including our semi-enclosed seas, our bays, our estuaries, sustain us. They're a source of oxygen that we breathe. The oceans produce 1.6 gigatons of oxygen each year that is outgassed into the atmosphere, and we're the source of the Great Oxygenation Event and the second event 600 million years ago that completely transformed our atmosphere and the potential for life on Earth. Over 100 million tons per year of fish are harvested through wild fisheries and aquaculture and are an important source of protein for much of the world. And the oceans have determined the highways for commerce, the sites of civilizations, and the outcomes of history. They're a source of wonder and inspiration, from literature and art and music to just the wonders of the organisms that live in the ocean, both at the surface and at depths. And importantly, the ocean buffers us from problems created by the 7.7 billion people that currently inhabit the Earth. It absorbs heat. About 93% of the energy imbalance caused by increasing greenhouse gases is stored in the oceans as heat. It absorbs carbon dioxide, over 23 million tons of carbon in the last few decades, and it dilutes nutrients, about 73 million tons per year of human-created nitrogen. But the capacity of the oceans is not limited. The ultimate source of the problem is the nearly tripling of the human population since the middle of the last century, and with it, greatly increasing nitrogen fertilizer use, CO2 emissions, and other changes to the Earth system. And as a result, our oceans are becoming increasingly hot, sour, and breathless. And it's this breathless part of the change that I want to especially talk about, why the ocean is losing its breath and why that's causing problems. So I'll talk a little bit about why oxygen is declining in the ocean, effects, and just a bit on what we can do. And you just heard some really detailed initiatives that are critical. Just a couple of definitions as I switch back and forth a little bit, and the way I describe this. The term ocean deoxygenation simply means oxygen decline, and I'll use the term hypoxia some, and although we sometimes ascribe particular levels of oxygen to the term hypoxia, really what we're talking about is simply oxygen low enough to alter physiological and ecological processes. So the first point is that low oxygen does occur naturally in the oceans. If we look at the open ocean, the oxygen minimum zones occur at depths of about 100 to 1,000 meters, especially along the western coasts of continents or the eastern boundaries of oceans. But even some of the estuaries and semi-enclosed seas, at least at some periods of history, have experienced low oxygen, whether it's especially during warm periods, as in the Gotland Basin in the Baltic, or intermittently and with much milder oxygen depletion in Chesapeake Bay. But the real problem is that the oxygen loss is really expanding, and oxygen is declining currently in both the open ocean and in coastal waters. Since 1950, over 600 coastal systems have been identified with oxygen concentrations that are less than about 20 or 25% of the oxygen that they can hold. And over the same time period, the open ocean has lost about 2% of its oxygen inventory, or over 150 billion tons of oxygen. And we know this from long-term measurements that show open ocean oxygen decline, as well as from modeling and analyses that have managed to put together the information at various sites here showing in the Pacific, but that have been critical all over the world. And we know this in our coastal waters also from long-term measurements. So the fundamental process that causes oxygen decline is aerobic respiration. Organisms using aerobic respiration take up oxygen and release carbon dioxide. And oxygen declines when the introduction of oxygen through photosynthesis or through ventilation mixing of atmospheric oxygen into waters, and from highly oxygenated waters to more oxygen depletion waters, when that process is less than the rate of oxygen consumption. And the balance becomes tipped towards oxygen decline by processes that increase respiration, like nutrient enrichment, or that increase temperature. And also by processes that reduce oxygen introduction, which is anything that reduces ventilation, causes long residence times, and even on a day-night cycle, darkness. So the first process, and you've heard a lot about it, and people living in and working in the Baltic system clearly know a lot about this issue, but the process of eutrophication, or too much nutrients, is a major driver of oxygen decline. As nutrients are added through agriculture, through fossil fuel burning, through sewage, it stimulates production of algae and organisms in the surface waters, and as that biological production sinks down to bottom waters, microbial respiration as the organic matter is decomposed, uses up oxygen. The other major driver in the open oceans and also in coastal systems is warming. Warming decreases the introduction of oxygen into deeper waters by stratifying, more strongly stratifying the water column, because warmer water is less dense than cooler water. It alters ocean currents. It decreases oxygen solubility. Warm water can hold less oxygen than cooler water. And it also increases oxygen consumption because respiration rates increase as temperatures increase. Global models predict substantial oxygen loss under both the business as usual greenhouse gas scenario and under more optimistic scenarios. And that oxygen loss shown in brown in these figures is predicted to happen at all levels of the ocean. And the point, one of the points to make, if you actually read the numbers on these graphs, some of these numbers and some shown in the previous figure may make it look like these changes in oxygen can be very small. But research has shown that even very, very tiny changes in oxygen can be really critical. In the deep ocean areas where oxygen is already low, much less than even a 1% change in oxygen saturation of the waters can make the difference between important organisms in these deep food webs being absent or being relatively abundant. So what does low oxygen do? Low oxygen essentially affects everything in the oceans. It affects biodiversity, it affects food webs, determines which species can be dominant in food webs. It affects biogeochemical processes, including processes that have the potential to feed back to the Earth's climate system or to fuel further oxygen decline. It's a potent force in evolution and adaptation. It affects habitats from the poles to the tropics. It affects biological processes from the physiological to the population level. And it can be it has the potential to be important to fisheries, economies, and human health, especially in developing nations where communities are very, very dependent on local resources and don't have the ability to move elsewhere and to switch to other sources of food and livelihoods. So because oxygen is natural, or oxygen gradients are natural, oxygen has been a really potent force in evolution, including in the evolution of land animals. But in the ocean, organisms that live in these deep, low oxygen areas have evolved amazing adaptations to that life, from elaborate gills to the ability to deal with toxic sulfides, to sustaining populations at extremely low oxygen conditions. And even in areas where low oxygen is fairly recent, we find some adaptations, whether it's behavioral avoidance, whether it's simply extreme tolerance to low oxygen, or the ability of fish within hours to days of exposure to remodel gills, to add red blood cells to their circulatory system. Low oxygen or oxygen variability in oxygen creates biologically relevant spatial structure to bodies of water, whether it's laterally in the open ocean, or here's Chesapeake Bay, or as you go deeper into the water column. It also creates economically relevant spatial structure. Fishers know where to put their nets, to put their crab pots, in highly oxygenated areas rather than in deeper or more severely affected locations. And it alters food webs. If we do experiments looking at the ability of top predators and systems to capture prey, what we can find are some of the top predators like jellyfish and ctenophores can become much more dominant in food webs because they are not as impaired by low oxygen as their prey or as finfish with which they compete. It also increases energy flow to microbes. So as oxygen becomes lower and lower, more and more of the energy in food webs goes to microorganisms as the terminal electron acceptors switch from oxygen in the highly oxygenated waters to nitrogen, iron, sulfur, and carbon. And all of these topics that I'm mentioning, we're going to hear a lot more about by other speakers. This switch also causes spatial variation in both microbial communities and biogeochemical cycles. As one moves down the water column, the relative importance of microbes that can use these different metabolic pathways changes. And it can have important reproductive effects. One of the counterintuitive things that we're finding for finfish is that some of the species that are actually fairly tolerant of low oxygen may be some of the ones that are really strongly influenced. Fish, crabs, octopus, virtually any mobile animal ever tested can detect and at least has some ability to avoid low dissolved oxygen concentrations. And this causes big shifts in distributions of animals. But some of the animals that are fairly tolerant will hang out at the margins of low oxygen areas, and chronic exposure can be really devastating. So if you look at gonad size, for example, this is an Atlantic croaker from the Gulf of Mexico off of the US waters. Gonads are much larger, ovaries are much larger at fish in sites where oxygen is high than when it's low. And chronic exposure to low oxygen can essentially act as an endocrine disruptor. And these effects on reproduction then, if we put them into models, translate into population effects over time. An important point, though, is that low oxygen does not occur in isolation. There are lots of changes to the oceans. And low oxygen occurs together with warming seas that I mentioned earlier, changes in pH, that respiration that's using up the oxygen is adding carbon dioxide, acidifying waters, and in addition, atmospheric carbon dioxide is acidifying ocean waters, changes in primary production that sometimes result in algal blooms, and fishing. And all of these can combine with oxygen to really alter ecological processes. And the role of oxygen in this can be really critical because oxygen supply can limit the ability of an organism to respond to other stressors in the environment. When oxygen is in abundance, ATP production or energy production within an organism, the transformation of food into energy, proceeds, and there's lots of energy for an organism to both maintain its critical processes, to grow, to reproduce, to defend against pathogens, and even to store energy. But when oxygen is scarce, energy is not converted efficiently food is not converted efficiently to oxygen, and organisms are dealing with additional costs because of oxygen itself, may not be able to do that, may not be able to maintain basic homeostasis and stress repair, and certainly have limited capacity and limited energy available for growth, reproduction, and other life processes. So as temperature increases, oxygen requirements of animals also increase, but at the same time, oxygen is declining. So if we look at the change in the oxygen saturation that is required for survival of a wide range of marine animals, it increases with each increasing degree of temperature. So that oxygen becomes really critical. The combination of oxygen and temperature becomes really critical. And again, as temperatures increase, less oxygen is available, and yet animals require more oxygen. The correlation between Acidification and low oxygen can be seen worldwide. And that's true whether you look at a depth profile going from the surface down to depths at the Costa Rica Dome or any other deep sea site, or if you look at just a couple of meters of water in Chesapeake Bay or in tropical mangrove ponds in Belize or in Panama. There's a lot of variation in results of experiments trying to understand how the combination of low oxygen and acidification affect organisms and ecological processes, but we know that at least sometimes it's really important. Some experiments that we've done on a nearshore fish that lives in Chesapeake Bay and on the east coast of the United States shows that they require higher oxygen concentrations when pH is also low than when just oxygen is low. And that's true for the point at which they raise to the surface to try to use that microfilm, highly oxygenated surface layer, or when the low oxygen actually causes death. One of the real things of concern for management, and that it's really important to begin incorporating into management strategies for fish, is the potential interaction of oxygen and fisheries. If you take a look at the Gulf of Mexico, this is off the Gulf Coast, the southern coast of the United States, off of Louisiana, where there's a very large low oxygen zone. If you do sampling, what you'll see, the lowest oxygen area is shown here in black. These circles are where the shrimp are. So the shrimp are moving out of the low oxygen areas and are found especially along the edges of this low oxygen zone. If you then look at where the fishing boats are, they're in the same locations because the fishers know how to track their targets. And in fact, as the hypoxic areas become larger and larger, the overlap between the shrimp and the fishing vessels increases as they're both squeezed into smaller and smaller amounts of water. And the concern is that this increases the efficiency of fishing and therefore the potential for overfishing. And this isn't limited to shrimp in the Gulf of Mexico. This is something that is of concern worldwide, and it's of concern in the open ocean as well. If you look at the depth at which billfish are found, where dissolved oxygen is high, they can use the whole water column, and at least some of the individuals and part of the population are quite deep. But as oxygen concentrations are lower and lower, they're squeezed towards the surface and more easily caught by fishing vessels. Another thing that is of concern is the potential for low oxygen to increase disease problems in marine organisms. And this has been seen in host organisms ranging from bivalves to crustaceans to finfish, and from pathogens ranging from dinoflagellates to viruses to protists to worms. In many, many cases, low oxygen exposure, chronic low oxygen exposure especially, compromises the immune response of animals. But it's not just long-term severe exposure. We've taken a look a little bit at what happens in areas where you have shallow areas with big day-night fluctuations in oxygen, which can really vary across the landscape of a system like Chesapeake Bay or the coastal waters of the Baltic, to take a look at how it might affect a pathogen, Perkinsus marinus, that infects oysters and has been a major management issue and caused population declines in Chesapeake Bay and elsewhere. And what we find, even when animals are just exposed for a few hours a day to these low oxygen events that are not severe enough to kill an adult oyster, as the average minimum daily oxygen concentration declines, the prevalence of these infections greatly increases when salinity is high enough for disease transmission to occur. So even just very brief exposures can have very strong effects. So what we know the most about, and again, this is what we heard earlier, is we know quite a bit now about what the major causes are in terms of warming, changes in precipitation in coastal areas. We know a lot about oxygen effects on individuals. We know about effects at the local scale. We know what the present-day patterns of oxygen decline are. And we do know that important feedbacks can occur to the climate system and to cause further deoxygenations. But we have some real challenges in scaling that up. We need to get better at scaling from the individual to populations, ecosystems, to fisheries stocks, and to future times. We need to much better understand what it means to food security and economies. We can cite examples where it can cause devastation to local economies, where people get sick because they can't afford to not eat the fish that have been killed by low oxygen events and suffer from histamine seafood poisoning. But on a much larger scale in terms of fisheries and economics, we have a lot to learn. And we have a lot to learn about the magnitude of feedbacks to biogeochemistry and to the climate system. And maybe because of all of these, decline is often not well integrated into policy discussions of effects of climate change in the oceans. On a very local scale, whether you're in Chesapeake Bay or in the Baltic, we know that there's a problem. We can see it. It's close by. It's caused by our local actions. But on a global scale, there's a lot of work to do. The solutions to it include not just science, although science is needed, but incorporation into policy, technology development, financial investments and incentives, and changes in consumption patterns. The good thing is that the steps to restore ocean oxygen can directly benefit people as well. Reducing nutrients means reducing nutrient delivery to coastal systems means improving sanitation, which has the potential to improve human health. It can improve agricultural efficiency and air quality. A major factor in improvement in oxygen conditions in the Chesapeake is actually from the Clear Water Act, not from things that we're doing with agriculture and sewage. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions, there's no question that that is a critical issue if human life and civilization is going to continue on this earth. And we need to, and managing fisheries in ways to reduce oxygen decline and its effect also can have benefits in terms of more sustainable fisheries production. For nutrient over-enrichment, we have many of the solutions. Not all, but we have many that can reduce runoff from agriculture, can improve wastewater treatment, and NOx emissions from power generation. Planning regulations and clear goals are critical if we're going to improve oxygen in coastal waters, and it takes both the political will and financial investment to do this. but it can work. We can see cases nearby where reductions in nutrients, in this case especially from sewage, going into waters can result in strong increases in oxygen concentrations over time in response to management actions. And we're starting to see hints of improvements in Chesapeake Bay, where the volume of anoxic water is less now than it used to be. I'm not going to presume here to tell you all what the solutions are for climate change. There have been recent IPCC reports that strongly show that we not only need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but we need carbon sequestration and capture methodology. But there are a lot that we can do, even if we're not the scientists working on those methods. One of the things, whether we're talking nutrients or we're talking climate change and its relation to oxygen, is that we all need to increase our engagement with civil society and with policymakers. As scientists, we need to increase and improve communication. We need to start talking about the big picture of the problem. We need to develop language to communicate its importance. And we need to think about what affects people really care about if they're going to change the way they're living and the way they're investing their resources. And one of those things that we all care about is the world that we're leaving for our children and for our grandchildren. We also have opportunities for involvement, for example, for the upcoming United Nations Decade of Ocean Science. As Dan mentioned earlier, several of us are also working together with colleagues, working with UNESCO on this critical issue, both to increase capacity for scientific advances in developing countries, to help integrate science for people working on coastal systems and working on in the open ocean, and to help with data access, and also to really work on this communication issue to make sure that everybody knows that the decline of oxygen in our oceans is a critical issue. So first of all, again, I would really like to thank Dan and thank the Royal Swedish Academy for making this event possible, the members of the Global Ocean Oxygen Network, and IOC, my home institution, and many collaborators, and thank you all for coming.